Hi everyone, good to be here today. My name's Flemming. I'm a co-founder, director of Aspire Scientific, and we're a medical writing agency based in Oxford and Manchester, UK. I'm going to be talking today a little about the role of a medical writer in MedComms, my career to date in the industry, and what it is that you as PhD students, postdocs and others interested in entering a career in MedComms might learn from that journey. So just to begin with, what is it that a medical writer typically does, or specifically a medical writer in MedComms? At a basic level, we help pharmaceutical companies to communicate about their drugs to healthcare professionals. As noted by the footnote on the slide, however, it's not quite as simple as that. So as well as pharmaceutical companies, you might be working with biotechs, diagnostic companies and device companies. And there are also other audiences involved as well as healthcare professionals. So I'm thinking of patients and payers and other relevant audiences. So a medical writer at a basic level should write high quality scientific copy in many different therapy areas and in many different formats. So just to give an overview of some of the services that a MedComms company would typically deliver. As I said, this is just a flavour of some. There are a lot of different services involved in MedComms. And publications is something that I'll talk about in a bit of detail in my talk. It's something that I've had a lot of experience in over the years. But there are others, such as educational materials. So this may be educational materials for healthcare professionals themselves, or it may be for internal company staff. For example, if they are beginning to work in a new therapy area, they would need educating in that therapy area. As a medical writer, quite often involved in meetings of various different types. So for example, you might be asked to attend a large scientific or medical congress on behalf of a pharmaceutical company client to report from that congress and produce a written report at the end of it so that everybody in the company knows exactly what the highlights from that meeting were. There are also a whole raft of services involved in strategic consulting and the commercial side of things. Increasingly important are digital projects such as websites, apps and e-learning. So I said that I'll talk a little bit in a little bit more detail about publications. So what do I mean by that? So here are some key examples. So at the basic level, you might help the authors and pharmaceutical company draft an abstract for a congress. So I'm sure you all know what that is, an approximately 250-word summary of, for example, a clinical trial. If that abstract is submitted and then accepted by the congress, you may be involved in helping the authors develop the poster or the slide presentation related to that abstract. When the full results from a clinical study are out, you may be involved in helping to write the full manuscript from that for submission to peer-reviewed journal. And other articles that may be submitted to peer-reviewed journals include review articles, whether they be narrative reviews or systematic reviews, and also meta-analyses. So as a medical writer, I've said that you will be involved in that process of writing, for example, a clinical study manuscript. What does that actually mean in practice when you're working in a MedComms agency? So I put this slide together just to try and give you a feel for how that would work in practice. So typically, the results of a clinical trial have come in. The authors and the pharmaceutical company are keen to get the results out as soon as possible. So the process might start with a teleconference or a face-to-face meeting with a study sponsor, so a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company, etc., and the authors. And the authors typically are the clinicians or scientists involved in running the clinical trial. So at that teleconference or face-to-face meeting, you would reach a broad agreement on what's going to be covered in the manuscript, how the data might be presented in different forms, and other things such as what the target journal may be. After that teleconference or face-to-face meeting, you should then receive a brief as a new writer from a more experienced colleague who would then ask you to go away and produce what we call a bulleted outline. So as the name suggests, a bulleted outline is just a short document which outlines what's going to be included in the main draft of the manuscript. the purpose of producing that document is to get agreement from all the authors that you are heading in the right direction before you go on and produce a first draft. So after you've written the outline yourself as a new writer in an agency, it will be reviewed by a more senior colleague. You'll no doubt have to address comments on it, and that process may go back and forth 2 or 3 times, depending on the project. But once your senior colleague in the agency is happy with it, that it's of suitable quality to go out to the authors and the study sponsors, it will then be sent for them to review. And based on the comments you get back on the outline, whether that's general agreement with the proposed content or suggestions for additional content or changes in what's going to be included, you will go ahead and write the first draft. Obviously that process continues. There are numerous drafts often involved in the process before you get to submission, but really that process just continues through a cycle until everybody's happy that the final draft of the manuscript is ready for submission. A really important point to make with respect to publications is that as a medical writer, you are there to assist the authors in preparing publications and presentations. So you yourself would not be an author, although your involvement in developing the publications should always be acknowledged in the publication itself. You are there to be guided by the authors on what the content should be, in effect. So there are well-known, in our industry at least, well-known guidelines on this. Probably the most important, well, definitely the most important being good publication practice. And the third version of those guidelines is now out, GPP3. There are other guidelines to be aware of as a medical writer working in publications too, and a lot of those guidelines are actually about the specific content of an article. So for example, consort is a well-known statement that guides what should be included in the report of a randomised controlled trial. And I would really recommend that you have a look on the Equator website. So if you Google Equator Oxford, I'm sure you'll find the Equator website, and that has a whole load of different guidelines for reporting different types of studies. So just to go back a step, as I said, I wanted to give you a flavour about my career in medical communications. But first of all, how did I get into the industry? So before MedComms, I studied for BSc and MSc degrees in physiology at Newcastle and King's. I then worked for a year as an editorial assistant at the Royal Pharmaceutical Society in Great Britain in London. After that year, I decided that I hadn't quite done with academia, so I headed up to Leeds to study for a PhD. So the PhD in Leeds took about 3.5 years, and then I stayed on in the same lab and took for an 18-month postdoc position. At the end of that, I decided that at that point I had my fill of academia, for want of a better phrase. And these are just some of the drivers that helped me to make that decision. So at that stage as a postdoc, I could see a narrow career path ahead of me. So a lot of fellow postdocs, PhD students, but not many permanent positions, not many permanent lectureships or research positions. So I was faced with a prospect of more short-term postdoc contracts, which in and of itself wouldn't have been a problem. But at that point, I really knew it was time for a change and that I wanted to pursue a career in another field. So why at that point did I identify medical writing as a potential option? Well, I definitely wanted to stay in science. I enjoy science, hence why I'd studied it for so long, and I wanted the qualifications that I gathered in the previous 10 years to be of worth. After discovering that MedComms existed as an industry, I began to speak to people in the industry, and it became clear that there was a good career pathway available to people. At a lot of agencies there appeared to be good mentorship and training programs in place, and there were a whole lot of other benefits, some of which were listed on the slide, but the basic driver for me to become a medical writer was that I always enjoyed writing, and based on feedback that I got during my academic career, for example when writing essays at undergraduate level or writing my PhD thesis, I always got really good feedback on my writing. So that is why I entered MedComms. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my experiences, particularly when I first started in the industry, to give you a little flavour of the ups and downs of working as a medical writer in MedComms. So there are definite challenges in the industry, and especially as a medical writer. It's worthwhile knowing before you consider entering the profession that it really is a highly deadline-driven industry. There are a lot of projects ongoing, and there's always a deadline ahead of you. Even when you finish one, there'll be another one lurking very soon. So you have to be able to work to a deadline. As a medical writer, and especially a new medical writer, you have to get used to criticism. That should be constructive criticism. You should be getting worthwhile and useful feedback on your writing from your colleagues. But even as a very experienced medical writer, there will be very, very few occasions where you get a reply from either a colleague or a healthcare professional saying no comments. It's very, very rare. So you have to develop a bit of a thick skin. I've got to be honest, sometimes as a medical writer, when I say, you deliver a project and then there's another one coming down the line, sometimes, if I'm honest, it can feel like a bit of a treadmill sat at your laptop or your computer. However, obviously I'm still in the industry, so there are a lot of upsides that I value, one of which being variety. So as a medical writer in a comms agency, you will get to work in a lot of different therapy areas. So just listed on these slides are some therapy areas that I knew nothing about when I joined MedComms, but for which I can now claim to have some level of good knowledge, at least in terms of being a medical writer. I really enjoy the team environment of working in a MedComms agency. So as a medical writer, you shouldn't be working in isolation. You'll be working with other people, including account managers, so the people who are responsible primarily for liaising with the client, working out project timelines and discussing finances with the clients. May also be involved in business development, so getting opportunities to, for example, pitch to potential new clients. And also in the process of developing different types of materials, you'll often work closely with design. Another upside of MedComms and working as a medical writer is a potential for travel. Often this is not quite as glamorous as it might look because you're stuck in a hotel working on, for example, some slides for a presentation the day after at a big medical congress. So often you don't get to see a lot other than an airport and a hotel. But nevertheless, you can often take the opportunity to stay out there for a day or two. One of the things that I really like as a medical writer is that you are working with the experts. So to give you one example, a common meeting that you might attend as a medical writer is an advisory board. So this is a meeting where a pharmaceutical client, for example, has brought together 10, 15 experts in a particular disease, for example, to discuss the results of the phase 2 trial and what they should do at phase 3. As a medical writer, you'd be expected to sit at the meeting and listen, and then produce a report summarising the discussions and what the recommendations from the experts were. So it's really quite a privileged position as a writer to be sat there in the room with those experts in the field, but also quite challenging to be able to keep up with the level of discussions and produce something coherent and worthwhile at the end of it. Once you're in the industry, and I appreciate that that is often the challenge for people at the start to actually get that entry position, once you get in the industry, there are a whole lot of opportunities open for you. There really is a demand for people who have got experience as medical writers and who are good medical writers. As I alluded to earlier, one of the things I identified when I was considering a career in medical writing was that there appeared to be a good career pathway. So this just shows a typical pathway that someone who enters as a medical writer may follow if they decide to stick in the editorial side of things. So you often enter as what's called an associate medical writer. After a year or two, you may be promoted to a fully fledged medical writer. From there are a number of steps, including senior writer, principal writer, or editorial manager, with an editorial manager being someone who may be involved in line management more than a principal writer would be, who perhaps is more interested in continuing with the job of writing. So just to talk about my career. So I started as a medical writer in a MedComms agency in Macclesfield in the UK, 2003. After a couple of years, I moved to another agency nearby as a senior writer. At the same agency, a year later, I became an editorial manager. So as I mentioned, took on a responsibility for some line reports and some other responsibilities. And then after a couple of years, I actually became a freelance writer and consultant on publication planning. So that was a little divergence from the slide that I showed earlier. But it is an option open to people once they've been in the industry for a while. So at that point, I wanted to challenge myself to run my own business. And there were a few other drivers for making that decision for me personally at the time. After 3 years as a freelancer, I actually joined forces with another experienced medical writer to set up Aspire Scientific. So just to talk a little bit about Aspire Scientific now. So we are a boutique medical writing agency led by experienced professionals. So that's myself and my business partner and other scientific directors in the team. And we are supported by what we really do think is a select team of talented and educated writers. So we are a medical writing agency. We don't say that we're a MedComms agency, so we're very much focused on medical writing, delivering a lot of the things that I've talked about earlier. So doing a lot of publications, being involved in publication planning, delivering side kits, the advisory board reports that I've discussed earlier. And something that I wanted to highlight today, which is hopefully of relevance to you guys, is that we are quite unusual as an agency in that we offer writing experience for people such as yourselves who are studying for PhDs or postdocs. So we offer project-based experience on live projects. So if that's something you're potentially interested in, please do get in contact with me. All we ask for is a CV and a 250-word summary of your current research focus. The reason for asking for the 250-word summary is really to give us a flavour of your writing style at that point. So I would welcome people to get in contact with me about that. And just to wrap up, what is it that you may be able to learn from my experiences in MedComms? Well, I think a lot of you will be really pleased to know that your PhD and postdoc are definitely valued. It's often quite hard to see that when you're at your stage, to find a career where those qualifications and that experience is so highly valued. But on the other hand, you are starting in a new industry and you need to prove your worth and to get to grips with that new environment. But as I've said, once you've done that, there are a lot of opportunities within the industry. Just some tips from me about potentially applying for jobs. Some of the things you should think about before doing that. So make sure that you can demonstrate your writing experience and indeed your writing skills, your research skills, your scientific accuracy, and your ability to work in a team. I also think it's useful if you're beginning to apply for a role as a medical writer, particularly one involved in publications, that you show at least some awareness of guidelines such as GPP3 and consort. And just to wrap up, feel free to contact me, as I said, to discuss the potential of work experience or if you have any other questions about medical writing in general. Thanks very much.